Taylor. I'm Creator of Selections, and we are pleased to have with us tonight Terry Dunham, who, judging by all the chit-chatting and handshakes he was doing tonight, I'm sure he needs no introduction, but since I wrote one, I'll go ahead and read it in.
My ego needs this, Jeff.
I will mention just first off, if you enjoyed tonight's lecture, we have two other lectures coming up. One is November 8th. Stu Allen will be here to talk about the 1939 Parade of Progress and the efforts to restore a GM Futureliner bus that was taken around on that Parade of Progress. And also January 24th, we'll have Steve Castiner, Buick and General Motors designer, and many of you are familiar with the Buick Blackhawk show car. His company built that automobile. But back to tonight's speaker. Terry Dunham is retired from General Motors Sales and Service Division. He spent remarkably none of those years with Buick. He spent his first 4 with Chevrolet and the last 25 with Pontiac, although he assures me that he had nothing to do with Pontiac Aztec. Today Terry does consulting work for the automotive industry, and in 1993 he started Automotive Research Services, which supplies specialized research packages to owners of vintage Buick. If anyone is restoring a vintage Buick, Terry is a must-call. He is author of the award-winning article, Cobwebs and Overhead Valves, an in-depth study of the development of the first overhead valve engine, and is also co-author of The Buick, A Complete History, which is a must-read for any automotive enthusiast. He has served on the board of directors of the Buick Club of America, and has also served as their vice president. Terry Dunham.
Thank you very much. And thank all of you. You have no idea what a pleasure it is for me to be here tonight. Jeff asked me, I think maybe a month and a half or 2 months ago, if I'd like to come up to Flint and be a part of the new Engineered for Speed gallery that's out here. I think he was a little overwhelmed in my enthusiasm because I don't think it usually works that way, does it, Jeff? Not everybody is as happy to come back here to Flint as I am and share an evening with you nice folks. I'm just delighted to see so many people here, and especially so many people that I know personally. That is really, really very rewarding for me. I think you're going to have a lot of fun here tonight. I started about, well, I was going to say started 5 years ago. My interest in Buick Racing, the early part that was done by the Buick team between 1908 and 1911, really started about 30 years ago. I have collected sales catalogs, brochures, and done a lot of reading over the years, and there were these tantalizing little tidbits in there that Buick was advertising about what their team had accomplished and what the accomplishments of the team meant to the success of Buick and to the automobile industry in general. And the more I kept reading, the more I realized that these had to be a very interesting group of men and that they had to have accomplished some phenomenal things. And sure enough, in bits and pieces over the coming 30 years, I managed to put together what was really a very large jigsaw puzzle, a little piece at a time, to figure out what these guys had done while they were out there running around the country shredding the rule book and winning a lot of races. It has been just a fascinating story. About 5 years ago, I was asked to do an article for the AACA, and I agreed and picked the topic of early Buick racing. It had been covered in some depth in the book that Larry Dustin and I did, The Buick, A Complete History. But I knew since the book's publication in 1980 that there was a whole lot more that really needed to be added to that story. So when I was asked to do that work, that's what I selected to do. It, as many things do that really interested me, it turned out to own my mind before I was done. Some of these things become so complex and so convoluted that you wind up thinking about them in your sleep, and then waking up in the middle of the night understanding something that had fallen into place as far as the jigsaw puzzle is concerned. I know that a lot of you here this evening are very familiar with engine construction and valve configurations and things like that, but there will be some here that are not. So I wanted to spend just the first few moments to talk about engines at Buick, and specifically the overhead valve engine and what it meant. Joe Thomas, you're a sharp guy. What was overhead valve?
Valves ahead.
Where were they? Were they over the piston, above the piston, or beside the piston, or where?
Okay, I got you. Got an overhead valve, the pistons were, the valves were centered over the piston, which allowed the fuel to get in where it belonged.
Absolutely right. Roberta, do you know what valve and head was?
Valve in the head.
That's as good as Joe. As Joe has indicated to us, overhead valve is an engine design with the intake and exhaust valves located in the cylinder head above the piston. Almost all engines built today are overhead valve. The two little guys down here at the bottom, and Joe, you'll recognize that motor. That's out in Linden, Nebraska.
Minden, yeah.
Minden, I'm sorry, Minden, Nebraska, that's right. Harold Moore Pioneer Village Museum. And that's a stationary engine. This particular one was built here in Flint, but the identical engine, with the exception of the fact that the name tag was changed to Detroit, was also built in Detroit. And the first overhead valve engines built in the United States were stationary engines produced by Buick in Detroit. Engine development work done at David Buick's Detroit shop before 1903 was awarded the first U.S. patent for overhead valve. The Buick Motor Company actually owned the rights to the overhead valve engine in this country before moving to Flint. Valve and head, almost what Berta told us, is a Buick advertising term. It was first used around 1910 to promote the use of the overhead valve engine in the Buick automobile. Overhead valve was very important to Buick because Buick owned the patent rights to the design. That meant that Buick could truthfully advertise that it was using a superior, more powerful engine than those built and used by the competition. Now, Buick was very proud of that engine, and rightfully so. Many of the early sales catalogs were, in effect, textbooks to try and teach potential customers for the Buick automobile why these engines and why the Buick overhead valve configuration was better than those offered by the competition. The first one is the overhead valve design. The second one is the L-head or flathead design, where the valves are located on the same side of the piston but in the block. The T-head design is a relatively rare design. It has valves in the block and on opposite sides of the piston. The latter two, the L-head and the T-head, are nowhere near as efficient from a combustion or a breathing standpoint as the overhead valve is. And of course, that's really the statement that made the Buick engine and overhead valve a more efficient and a better engine. This is another example of Buick's early catalog advertising, once again, trying to educate the American public to why Buick had the best automobile engine that there was on the market. Valve and head was used, again, as the advertising term in many of Buick's early sales catalogs. Here's a 1916 sales catalog, and right on the very front cover, along with the name of Buick, is the term valve and head. The overhead valve engine was the single most important mechanical factor in the early success of the Buick car. It was vitally important to the success of the Buick company. This is the title for what you're going to see this evening. The first horseless carriages began to appear on America's streets in the closing years of the 19th century, and men of great vision and talent began to notice them. There was good reason. Fortunes were waiting for those astute enough to successfully design and market a car capable of attracting the public eye. Few understood how the new machines worked, and fewer yet knew how to successfully build and sell one, though thousands tried. Most who tried their hand at the new enterprise failed. Many lost everything, including their dignity in the process. It took a lot to succeed in the car business back then, much more than just a horseless carriage that could be cranked, started, and driven down the road without failing. It took something special. It took a feature, price, confidence in the company that had produced the contraption, something that would make the machine stand above the ashes of the failures that littered the industry at the time. In the case of the Buick and General Motors, it took a better engine. A patented overhead valve engine that Buick would come to advertise for the next 6 decades as the valve and head. The valve and head engine became so vitally important to the Buick company that it was eventually made a part of the Buick logo. It also took a Buick race team, a team driving cars powered by that same overhead valve design, to quickly get the word out to the American public that something special, something really powerful lay under the hood of a Buick automobile. Buick won a lot of races in its formative years, and in the process, men at Buick learned a lot about the fine art of the press release. Using a series of numbered publicity releases, the company called racing bulletins, Buick saved thousands of advertising dollars every time a Buick won at the track. William C. Billy Durant, who was then heading up the Buick Motor Company, would eventually utilize those dollars in 1908 when he formed General Motors.
Billy Durant did not like to waste money advertising, so he put money into the racing teams from 1908 until 1910. He had a very good racing team led by Wild Bob Berman and a fellow you may have heard of named Louis Chevrolet. They took those victories and used them in advertising.
At the same time Buick was blowing the competition into the weeds, America was reading a lot of good things about the Buick automobile in its morning newspapers, and a lot of new Buicks got sold as a result. Durant had things pretty well figured out. Durant was an industrial giant, one of the greatest businessmen this country has ever produced. He had an incredibly positive sales personality and a talent for business organization that was second to none in his time. His approach to the automobile business and his driven desire to succeed were closely aligned with a personal desire to win at virtually any cost. To Durant and the men around him, if winning meant bending the rules, then so be it. When Durant realized that his new enterprise, the Buick Motor Company, could best be promoted with a successful racing team, the idea that he might field a bunch of losers or also-rans never entered his mind. To Durant's way of thinking, you either won or you didn't. You were either the best there was or you weren't. Durant's willingness to do whatever it took to win was soon communicated to everyone else that had anything to do with his race team. By the time the team had fired up its engines for the last time, Durant's drivers had played fast and loose with the 3A rulebook and had shamelessly copied ideas from the competition. They had also used experimental technology in the stock production classes and had become famous for using every imaginable trick to gain an advantage over the competition. In fact, the team played so free and loose with the 3A rules that it is almost impossible today to figure out what they got away with. About the only thing the surviving documents clearly detail is the mischief the team got caught at. And since the 3A was forever catching Buick trying to run with its own special interpretation of the rules, it only stands to reason that Buick was able to get away with a whole lot more. In short, the team quickly became an extension of the Durant personality, a personality that was responsible for the creation of the General Motors empire, an empire that eventually grew to become the largest industrial corporation in the history of the world. And like Durant himself, the team did a great deal to promote both the Buick Company and the Buick automobile. Much of what happened during the few short years Buick was actively competing became the stuff of legend. The enviable heritage enjoyed by the team eventually evolved into a tradition rooted deep within Buick itself. It started in the engineering department and was clearly supported by company management. It is best described as an expectation of power, performance, and excellence in the Buick car, and it caused the Buick to become something of a sleeper when it came to competitive motorsport. It also made one of the most vivid advertising statements of all time highly believable. When better automobiles are built, Buick will build them. Just about the time Buick had been out of the racing business for a decade or so, someone would rediscover that the company was building a pretty fast car, and that, when properly set up, a Buick could deliver on the racetrack. Over the years, spectators have often watched in amazement as a Buick, heaven forbid, roared out of the last turn and pounded down the straightaway to the checkered flag well ahead of the competition. It happened that way one July day on Daytona Beach in 1940, when a 1939 Century unexpectedly won the event, lapping an overwhelming field of V8 Fords in the process. The Buick automobile has a rich, a colorful, and a proud history on the racetrack. Much of that history has been forgotten a long, long time ago. The story of the turn-of-the-century racing Buicks is an incredible tale. Fortunately, enough of the company's racing history has survived in bits and pieces so that it can still be told more than 90 years later. From 1908 to the early days of 1911, the Buick race team was a force to be reckoned with in this country. It wasn't an easy life. The team's drivers and riding mechanics laid life and limb on the line every time they climbed aboard one of their primitive machines and headed for a starting line. For protection against wrecks, they wore an inadequate thin leather helmet, goggles without safety glass, gloves, and high-laced boots. At racing speeds, there were no seat belts, only a primitive version of a harsh bucket seat to hold the men in place. Tires looked to be little more than rubber bands stretched around wooden spoke buggy wheels. In fact, tire and wheel failures were responsible for the maiming and killing of a number of early drivers, riding mechanics, and spectators. Pistons in some of the early Buick race engines looked like they were large enough to fill a small wash bucket. Once the riding mechanic had cranked it over, the explosive racket from an idling Buick race motor was fearsome. At full throttle, a stinky, smoky, deafening roar would surround the car. During a race, the blast of hot air and grit blowing off the track was formidable, and there were no windshields to deflect it. While at the track, Buick often headquartered in what was little more than a cold, dark barn with no electricity. Designated as the Buick camp, workbenches were often set up out of doors, covered with dust, to take advantage of the sunlight. This racing brotherhood was clearly not for the faint of heart. The members of the Buick team were a fearless, colorful, swashbuckling lot. And along the way to winning a lot of races and setting a lot of records, there was a cavalier attitude toward the rule book. Sometimes when those pesky rules got in the way, the team just ignored them. And sometimes there were consequences. In May of 1910, the 3A caught Buick trying to run in the stock production classes at Indianapolis with a series of hybrid hand-built race cars camouflaged with Buick Roadster identifications hung on the radiators. 3 Buick racing models, the 16A, 16B, and 100, were disqualified on the spot. Not to worry. On the train ride back to Flint, the Buick bad boys designed 2 new revolutionary single-seat race cars and then built them from scratch in the engineering department in just 2 weeks. The team put the finishing touches on its new red racing machines by painting a big ram's head on the hood of each car. With a fast glance over his shoulder to see if the 3A people were paying attention, Walter Marr, Buick's first chief engineer, was quick to tell the press why as the cars were publicly unveiled. That's to let them know we're butting back into racing, Marr said. Marr's statement to the press and the mean-looking ram's head painted on the engine cowling made it clear that Buick had actually decided to flaunt its 3A disqualification. The new cars were built with experimental 4-cylinder, 622 cubic inch overhead valve engines. Other features included a Bosch dual magneto, Schuckler carburetor, combination 4-speed and splash lubrication, leather-faced cone clutch, and a 3-speed selective transmission. Based on the rough lope of the massive engines at idle, it appears that the cars were also built with high-performance, long-duration camshafts. A 594 cubic inch overhead valve 4-cylinder, stealthily rated at a modest 100 horsepower, was the strongest engine in use by the team up until that time. Buick, ever cautious about truthfully admitting to the factual horsepower in its racing engines, decided to tweak the rules once again. The new cars were registered with the 3A as Buick 60 Specials. The 60 designated 60 horsepower, an impossibly low figure. History later came to know these 2 big thumpers as the Buick Bugs. The Bugs did not handle particularly well on a closed track, but when it came to straight and level competition, they were awesome. And still, Buick refused to let the matter die. Believing that a trump card still remained to be played with the 3A Rules Committee, Buick went hunting for its copy of the 3A Rule Book. Finding it in what must surely have been the engineering department's trash can, the team completed the necessary paperwork to change the classification of its blacklisted Buick Roadster race cars, registering them with the 3A instead as Marquette Buicks. It worked. The team got the cars back into competition in the exact same classes they had just been thrown out of by the 3A. If the four apocalyptic horsemen had ever switched to four-wheeled mounts, then surely it would have been racing Buicks they rode. Peter Help, the great racing artist and historian, once called the Buick team drivers that group of hellions. Peter Help knew what he was talking about. Durant and the men of Team Buick did far more than just march to the beat of a different drum. Taking into consideration how the team operated and what it was able to accomplish, history would surely say they were racing down the road ahead of the whole band. Buick's winning reputation on the racetrack started in 1904, almost coincidentally with the introduction of the Model B, Buick's first production car. On August 27th of that year, Walter Marr entered a Buick in a Grosse Pointe, Michigan 5-mile 3A sanctioned event and finished third. It was the first recorded entry of a Buick in competition. It wasn't a particularly auspicious beginning, but it gave Marr some practical racetrack experience he would draw on many times during Buick's formative years. A photograph taken November 3rd, 1904 shows 8 Model Bs all lined up on Main Street in Flint. 2 of the vehicles appear as a stripped chassis with no body. While there is nothing to document it, the machines look tantalizingly like the Buick strip chassis that were raced on the East Coast from 1904 through 06 by Buick's New York and New Jersey agent H.J. Kohler. Wherever Kohler obtained his machine, later that same month, on November 23rd, Kohler drove a Buick 2-cylinder strip chassis up Eagle Rock near Newark, setting a record for the class. By the end of 1904, Kohler had sold 2 new Buicks with their powerful new overhead valve engine. The following July, the Glidden Tour ended with a climb to the top of Mount Washington. Kohler once again showed up with a strip chassis, this time entered in the 2-cylinder class with A.H. Weiser driving. Weiser won with a time of 36 minutes, 24 seconds. Due in large part to the exposure his race cars were getting, Kohler sold 75 new Buicks during 1905. Kohler was back again on October 27, 1906, in a 100-mile race for strip touring cars at the Empire Track in Yonkers, New York. The Buick won, and it won again later that same day in a 3-mile race for stock cars selling under $1,500. From Thanksgiving Day of 1904 through Christmas 1906, Kohler accumulated no less than 36 racing cups and medals. And Kohler's new Buick sales were climbing right along with his racetrack success. On October 1st, 1906, Kohler ordered 500 Buicks, an order that amounted to a whopping 1/10 of Buick's 1906 production. Buick's early racing success was not confined to the East Coast. At the same time Kohler was running so successfully, former Buick employee Charles S. Howard, named the Buick agent in San Francisco in 1905, and his mechanic Frank Murray were actively involved. Howard was frequently quoted in San Francisco Bay Area newspapers as an authority on the benefits of racing and the resulting improvement that could be expected in stock production cars. Howard and Murray were formidable competitors and were responsible for a significant number of early Buick track victories. On October 26, 1906, Howard entered a strip Buick in a 10-mile handicap race sponsored by the Sonoma County Driving Club in Santa Rosa. A big Studebaker, which sold for nearly twice as much as the Howard Buick, was heavily favored to win. However, the Studebaker suffered ignition problems, allowing Howard to capture the first-place Silver Cup. Newspaper articles covering the event were highly complimentary of the little Buick 2-cylinder. Durant knew what was getting printed in the newspapers when his Buicks got into competition, and he liked all the free publicity. Never one to hesitate, he quickly took the necessary steps that allowed Buick to capitalize on its accomplishments. Sales catalogs, press releases, and newspaper advertisements all touted Buick's success at the track. In early June 1908, Durant approached Buick employee Bob Berman, offered to pay him $50 a week plus travel expenses, a handsome sum in those days, and asked him to form a company racing team. Berman agreed. It was a job he was well suited for, and much to Berman's delight, the contract he was asked to sign stated that the job would last until I am notified to the contrary by you. In another part of Berman's contract, Durant also agreed to pay for any and all physicians, surgeons, and medical and hospital bills incurred as a result of any accident I may sustain while in the discharge of my duties, which may accrue within 60 days of the time of such accident. Before Berman's career tragically ended in a Peugeot on a California racetrack in 1916, he would become one of America's premier racing drivers. Some would say he was better than the great Barney Oldfield. Berman was born on a farm in Imlay City, Michigan, low in the Michigan Thumb in 1884. He was one of Buick's first employees and is credited with having test driven the first Buick built in Jackson, Michigan in 1905, while the company was briefly producing automobiles there. Berman had earlier made a racing name for himself and had gained valuable experience while working for the local Jackson Automobile Company. While testing cars for Buick, Berman tried something he had seen bicycle racers do to improve their speed and machined a special gear for the cars he was testing. The change, which produced a lower numeric gear ratio in the drivetrain than the one installed in production, enabled Berman to run much faster on the test track. Durant was quick to notice what he had done. Berman went to work immediately. Eventually, he would bring together the Chevrolet brothers, Louis and Arthur, Louis Strang, C.E. Easter, George DeWitt, Louis Nickren, and many others who would successfully run under the Buick banner. Berman's racing strategy seemed simple enough. His car either held together running wide open and Berman won, or the car broke and Berman lost. There never seemed to be any middle ground for Berman, and as a result, there never seemed to be any middle ground for the rest of the team either. During its entire existence, the Buick team too often suffered from a lack of a cohesive racing strategy and discipline in the pits. The team thrashed its racing machinery unmercifully in what usually appeared to be nothing more than a brawling free-for-all. And while the Buick drivers won far more than their share of races, it cost them dearly. Living life on the edge became a part of the racing rules the team wrote for itself. Berman was a fearless competitor. His greatest success came in 1911 when he drove the Blitzen-Benz, a car formerly campaigned by Barney Oldfield, over a 1-mile course at 142 miles an hour. It was a speed greater than any ever attained by Oldfield. Berman was killed on his birthday, April 8, 1916, while driving a Peugeot in the Corona, California road race. Running hard, trying to make up time he had lost in the pits, a tire blew, flipping his car into the crowd. Berman, his riding mechanic, and a track guard were instantly killed. 5 spectators were injured, several seriously. The accident and the resulting mayhem stunned the racing community and was eventually responsible for a number of racing safety improvements. Louis Chevrolet, for whom the Chevrolet automobile is named, was a strong and powerfully built man. His strength became something of a legend in its own right. On one occasion, while hand cranking the engine in a team car, the engine backfired. Instead of injuring himself, Chevrolet held on and bent the crank in his hands. Born in Switzerland on Christmas Day, 1878, Chevrolet was educated in France and got his first racing and engineering experience there. He immigrated to America in 1900, and 5 years later, he was racing for Fiat in New York. On March 6, 1909, he joined the Buick team, and along with Berman and Marr, was responsible for the design and construction of a number of the cars raced by the team. Chevrolet was not the wild driver Berman was. In a head-to-head race, Berman usually came out the winner. However, Chevrolet died of natural causes in 1941. Chevrolet's first race in a Buick came in Detroit in 1906. At that time, Chevrolet was running as an independent and was not affiliated with a factory team. Berman asked Chevrolet if he would like to try his Buick. Chevrolet replied that he would, and he won the race. C.E. Easter. Charles Ewing Easter was a little guy, easygoing. He was constantly smiling, stood just 5 feet 2 inches tall, and weighed only 115 pounds. But what he lacked in physical stature, he more than made up for in determination on the racetrack. Easter had been nicknamed Hugh by his friends, and he did not like it. At every opportunity, he would correct newspaper journalists, or anyone else for that matter, who used the shortened version of his name, reminding them it was Charlie or C.E. Easter. Easter was born in 1881 and was first associated with automobiles in 1899. He raced with the F.B. Stearns team from 1905 to 1907, beginning with the formation of the Buick team in 1908 and continuing until the team was disbanded in early 1911. Easter competed with the smaller team cars based on the Model 10 chassis. Easter was a good driver and was proud enough of his association with the team to have kept a scrapbook. That scrapbook survives to this day. The documents, photographs, medals, and newspaper articles preserved by Easter provide a fascinating insight into how the Buick team operated and preserves events that would otherwise have been lost to racing history. Easter's biggest win with the Buick, he led every lap of the race, came on October 10, 1908 in the Motor Parkway Sweepstakes. The event opened the Long Island Motor Parkway and immediately preceded the 1908 Vanderbilt. Easter loved the car business. After retiring from his Buick Racing career, he spent the next 4 decades working as a highly successful Buick retail salesman. In 1911, he went to work for a dealer at the corner of Broadway and 55th Streets in New York and stayed there through the early 1950s. All during those years, Easter made a good living selling the same automobile he had helped to improve through his competitive efforts on the racetrack. The Buick team traveled from race to race in a railroad boxcar, specially identified and outfitted with everything needed to keep the cars ready for the track. The boxcar also carried a tow car to move the race cars from the railroad station to the track and was outfitted with a machine shop and a blacksmith forge. In the mid-1970s, Warren Hodge, a team mechanic and the last known surviving member of the team, was interviewed for the automobile quarterly book, The Buick: A Complete History. Hodge remembered that the team members were close to each other like members of a large family. It was long work and hard hours, he said, but in the end, success came. It was the team's job to make the Buick a better vehicle through trial and error. On September 7, 1908, Berman and his 40-horsepower Model 5 stock chassis were in Lowell, Massachusetts for a 250-mile road race. While running a 4-second to Strang, then driving Izetta, Berman crashed. Pulling off the track and into his camp area, Berman's crew performed some quick surgery, trying to get him back into competition. When the car pulled back on the track a few minutes later, 3A officials spotted a new radiator and a new front axle. Using new parts during the race to repair a car in competition was strictly against the rules, and Berman was disqualified. Durant, who was at the track, wired Buick's sales manager with the bad news. Model 5 and Berman behaved beautifully yesterday. No fault of either that we did not get second place. 3 laps ahead of nearest competitor for that position on 21st round. Our disqualification perfectly just due to our repair force not understanding the rules. Well, maybe. On the other hand, not understanding the rules was something of a continuing problem with Durant's team. Berman and Buick did well in the 1908 competitions entered by the company, but these early successes could hardly be called stellar. That all changed shortly after the Buick team got itself organized later that same year and showed up to race in the grand prize events held November 25th and 26th in Savannah, Georgia. I am often asked how some of the obscure information on the race team has managed to survive, and here's one way right here. This is Buick's great former chief engineer, Charlie Chain. He was an owner of the Bug and oversaw its placement here at the Sloan. In 1976, I interviewed him at his home in Pebble Beach, and this is about a 3.5 minute clip from that interview. He speaks very low, so I hope you're able to hear this all right.
Display cars back there was the Buick Bug. I understand that this was one of your automobiles at one time. And I was curious to know if you could give me any just little background history on the car. I know that the engineering department built it like in 1910 or 1911, something like that. And then
As I remember, that car was built in it was built in 9 and the early part of 10. And but you've got to go back quite a little ways there. You remember when Buick was racing, they were racing 2 sizes of car. The Model 10 size and the Model 17, 16, 17 size. That was the big 4. And they were in the Savannah race. And there's an interesting story on that. I don't know how true it is, but I would almost vouch for its accuracy. They built this series of underslung cars for the Savannah race. I don't know whether you were aware, but the Buicks in the Savannah race were underslung, both the small and the large models.
I didn't know that. I knew that they did a tremendous amount of racing and development for racing back in the early 1900s, but I didn't know
But that underslinging was quite secret because it was done in the freight cars on the way to the Savannah.
for heaven's sakes.
And the cars were not successful. Obviously, they hadn't gotten all the bugs out of them before the races started. And while they were down there, one of the Benz drivers, and this is where the story becomes questionable. There's some phases of it that don't sound possible, but I think they're true. It apparently was, they had a wreck, something happened to them. And for some reason or other, the car was left off the road, but beside the road, in the vicinity of the barn that the Buick crew were quartered in. And during the night, they went out and took certain parts of the Benz apart and looked at it, and they got a good idea of what the Benz was and how it was built and so on. And after that, the Buick Model 100 made its appearance. Now, the Model 100 is a Buick in which there are very few, if any, records. I never could find. But it was a large engined Buick, double chain drive, built only for racing.
Gee.
And that was the engine that later was used for the single-seater cars.
Anybody wants any specifications on the Buick Model 100? C. Greg Foss, he sold me those specs probably 20 years ago. You're going to see some of them later on in the presentation tonight. And the single-seater that he referred to was the Buick Buck. In other words, the development work that was done for the Buick Model 100s, which were a part of the illegal stealth Buick team cars, was later put into the Buick Buck. Not the exact engine, we'll get into that too. On a cold Michigan day, the team loaded up a boxcar and Plymouth and headed to Savannah for the first grand prize. The prestigious and highly visible international event would become the debut of the Grand Prize Racing Series in this country and would serve to showcase Buick's recent efforts to field a competitive race team. Buick's participation at Savannah has been well documented with photographs, memorabilia, and newspaper articles, all carefully preserved in the Easter scrapbook and by the Marr family. Automotive history must have been smiling on the work the track photographers did during those days at the races, because the images they captured amount to nothing less than a record of watershed events in the history of the Buick Company. 4 Buick race cars built on the smaller Model 10 chassis had been loaded into the boxcar at Flint that day, number 8, number 11, number 14, and number 16, along with car number 4, a larger Grand Prize racer specially built for Bob Berman. When the door to the boxcar was closed, all the cars had stock front and rear suspensions. When they were offloaded in Savannah, cars number 8 and number 16 and Berman's big number 4 had all been modified and were underslungs. The team, looking for any advantage you could gain at the track, had secretly modified the cars to an underslung configuration while traveling in the boxcar on the way to Savannah. The underslungs were much lower to the ground than a stock Model 10 and consequently had lower centers of gravity. It was the team's hope that the cars would corner better well in competition, thus giving Buick a significant racer's edge. The underslungs were indeed a surprise when they arrived at the track. However, they were also something of a disappointment, as they were not the dominant competition machines the team had hoped for. All four Model 10s had four-cylinder square engines with a 3 3/4-inch bore and stroke, Remy ignitions, cold clutches, 2-speed planetary transmissions, and 88-inch wheelbases. All weighed 1,560 pounds. All were rated by Buick on the entry forms at 18 horsepower, and all were entered in the light car road race run on Wednesday the 25th. Jeffers was in car number 6, Berman was in number 8, Hearn was in number 11, and Easter was in number 14. Jeffers and Hearn were not professional drivers. Both were local Flint residents and held driving positions on the team only until Berman could recruit a full complement of professional pilots. Berman was the fastest car on the track with a best lap time of 10 minutes 30 seconds. When the race started, Berman moved from 6th to 3rd place on the first lap, running at 53 miles an hour. He continued a steady 53-mile pace and led the race for several laps. But two mechanical failures, one of which cost him some 8 minutes in the pits, probably cost Berman the race itself. He finished second in the 196-mile run with an average speed of 51.4 miles an hour. Jeffers and the other underslung bet a steering knuckle and was out of 29 miles. Hearn finished fourth with an average speed of 49 miles an hour. Easter and his riding mechanic Frank Thompson had an incredible ride during the race and were lucky to escape with their lives. At 127 miles, while running ninth on the 13th lap, Easter powered into a bank turn at Walters Road and at Steele Avenue. As he entered the corner, Easter heard a sharp bang as the right rear axle broke and the right rear wheel came off the car. The resulting wreck was spectacular. The car somersaulted through the air, nearly hit a corner worker while airborne, and landed in a ditch. Easter, desperate to regain control, twisted the steering wheel so hard that it came off in his hands. Easter was thrown clear as the car rolled, and when he finally stopped bouncing along the ground, he was still holding onto the steering wheel. Luckily, he escaped with some bad bruises. Thompson, on the other hand, was thrown 50 feet through the air, rolled hard along the ground, and was knocked unconscious. There were early reports that Thompson had in fact been killed. Fortunately, he escaped with some bad injuries and required hospitalization. The accident was so spectacular that it made headlines the next day in the Savannah Morning News. Easter and Thompson had both been put under contract to drive for Buick on November 14, 1908, just before the team departed from Flint. Easter's agreement called for him to be paid $150 for driving in the race. Thompson was paid the princely sum of $30 a week to race with him as a riding mechanic and to work on the car. Fortunately, both men had the 60-day medical payment clause in their contracts. Berman's number 4 underslung, a big 50-horsepower 5-inch bore and stroke machine, was entered in the grand prize run on Thursday, a race restricted to engines with no more than a 6.10-inch bore. Berman ran 18th for 2 laps, suffered a suspension failure, and dropped out on the 3rd. The Buick team was disappointed with its showing at Savannah and made no secret of it. Better things were ahead. The real polish on the Buick Racing legend at Savannah came at the expense of the Benz team. While running nearly 100 miles an hour on the 11th circuit of the Grand Prize, one of the Benz cars, a 760 cubic inch overhead valve monster, driven by Fritz Earl, lost the tire tread from the right front tire. An eyewitness account from one of the corner workers stated that the tread had flown from the tire like a wounded snake. The corner worker also noted that a spectator who had rushed onto the track trying to grab the tread as a souvenir was burned on the hand by the steel studs embedded in the pneumatic mission. The flying tread struck Earl in the face and on the back of his head, knocking him unconscious and causing him to lose control, roll over, and wreck. Wreck, as good luck would have it, near where the Buick team was encamped. The overturned Benz suddenly presented Buick with an incredible opportunity that was almost too good to be true. The Buick team had experienced 2 suspension failures and 2 bad wrecks on its smaller cars while running in the light car race the previous day. Coincidentally, while running in the grand prize, Berman's big number 4 had experienced the right rear axle failure, a failure eerily similar to the one that had caused Easter's spectacular wreck. And to all Buick suspension problems, the fact that Berman was running almost last when he dropped out, and it becomes clear that Waldemar knew that some pretty big changes had to be made if Buick's race cars were ever going to be competitive. But at that point, Waldemar had no idea what those changes should be. Benz, one of the most feared and respected names in the racing world, was about to tell him. Only Benz didn't know. Earl had run as high as second in the grand prize and was positioned in 4th when he crashed. Another Benz driven by Victor Hemry, using an engine identical to the one Earl had in his car, finished the race in 2nd. Marr knew he could learn a lot from the design of the Benz machines, but he had no way of getting the information. When Earl's Benz wrecked, that all changed. With an enthusiasm he seldom displayed, Waldemar quickly inspected the suspension in the overturned Benz. Now, there's a note made at the bottom of the photo here. I've seen literally thousands of historical Buick photos over the years, and this sticks in my mind better than any other as one of the most important in the history of the company. Marr's inspection led to the creation of some cars that we'll talk about here in a few moments. And without those new cars, and without what he learned during this inspection, Buick would never, ever have come even remotely close to acquiring the record that they did while racing. Later, with no one around to say no, Marr also had a Buick photographer surreptitiously take pictures of the wrecked Benz's engine as it lay disassembled on workbenches inside the Benz camp. With the details of the world-class Benz overhead valve power plant in front of him, and with the finer points of the wrecked Benz's racing suspension committed to memory, Waldemar learned a lot about why the Benz machines were so fast, and he had pictures. The photographs taken that long ago day at the track still survive, carefully preserved by the Marr family. Among the many firms Durant had purchased while forming General Motors in 1908 was a car builder in Saginaw called the Marquette Motor Company. Dave Pilon, that photograph up there? The firm had earlier made a name for itself, building the Rainier automobile and a highly competitive racing car. When he got back to Flint, Marr used what he had learned about his Benz inspections at Savannah and built 3 large overhead valve 4-cylinder race engines. He then got 3 chassis built by the Marquette Motor Company and made them. The results were spectacular. Buick registered the smallest of its new cars with a 3A as the Buick 30s for 30 horsepower. What a joke. The cars were not Buicks at all. They were hand-built hybrid race cars, and they had a whole lot more than 30 horsepower. To add insult to injury, documented history also has it that private conversations were soon circulating a rumor in the engineering department that further questioned the legality of the cars. The rumor had it on good authority that the new race cars had all been built with special, read special as illegal, experimental transmissions. Later, just to thicken the smoke and mirrors camouflage with the 3A a bit, Buick listed the cars with the 3A as Buick Roadsters, and for a time, it worked. Eventually, these fast new Buicks came to be known as the Model 16A, with a wheelbase of 112.5 inches and a 56-inch tread and a 299 cubic inch engine. The Model 16B, also with a 112.5-inch wheelbase and a 56-inch tread, but with a slightly larger 318 cubic inch engine. and the Model 100 with a smaller 110-inch wheelbase, a 56-inch tread, and a large 594 cubic inch engine. Since Buick also built a stock production Model 16 Roadster in 1909 and 1910, the use of the number 16 as a designator for two of the new race cars was another clear attempt at factory stealth. The new engines were constructed with the then current 3A racing rules taken into consideration. It was, after all, a little hard to hide the displacement of an engine during a 3A teardown. However, sneaking by with an illegal chassis was another matter entirely. Billy Durant, Waldemar, and the Buick Company were clearly out for blood. The 318 cubic inch engine used in the Model 16B shared the same bore and stroke with a standard Buick production engine of the period. However, the many modifications and optional power equipment installed before the engine ever got to the track made it a far stronger power plant than its assembly line counterpart. Like its smaller brothers, the 16A and 16B, the Model 100 used a special frame supplied by the Marquette Motor Company. The Model 100s, 100 for 100 horsepower, were the most competitive cars raced by the team. Though not the single-seat, aerodynamic, state-of-the-art machines the Bugs were intended to be, the Model 100s combined a proven chassis technology with a powerful engine. As a result, they cornered and handled much better in competition than the Bugs did, and rightfully earned reputations as fearsome racing machines. The special 112.5-inch racing frame supplied by the Marquette Motor Company to build the 16A and 16B was only half an inch longer than the 112-inch frame used to build the Buick Model 16 production car. That made it relatively easy for Buick to sneak its illegal race cars into the stock production classes. The Buick Bugs had a much shorter 102.5-inch wheelbase and a narrower 48.5-inch tread. The unique chassis and racing body used on the Bugs were both fabricated in the Buick engineering department. The Bugs had two independent braking systems. Both were inadequate. The driver's brake pedal activated an externally contracting band on a drum attached to the transmission. A hand lever located to the right of the driver applied expanding brakes located at both rear wheels. Since neither system did much to slow the car down, it is safe to assume the driver also relied heavily on engine braking. The cars used a pressurized system to deliver gas and oil to the engine from storage tanks mounted behind the driver. The fuel tank was roughly twice as large as the oil tank. A small hand pump located on the left side of the cowl built pressure in both tanks. A gauge mounted on the dash informed the driver when the fuel pressure had dropped, and a separate oil level sight gauge let the driver know when the oil in the crankcase was running low. When the engine oil needed replenishing, the driver would reach down under his right leg and open a valve, much like a water spigot, allowing oil under pressure to run into the crankcase. When oil started blowing out the engine breathers, it was a signal to shut the oil off. 4 short chrome exhaust stacks protruded out from the left side of the engine colony, effectively directing the exhaust noise of the massive engine almost into the driver's face. When the driver backed off the throttle to slow down for a corner, long blue flames would erupt from all 4 stacks. The first outing Berman and Chevrolet made with the Bugs was on July 1st, 1910 in Indianapolis. Chevrolet made a half mile in 17.5 seconds in his car. Berman ran a quarter mile in 8.5 seconds with his. Both cars were timed at just over 105 miles an hour, with Berman being slightly faster. Chevrolet rolled his car over on its second practice lap, giving the rest of the team a bad scare. Fortunately, he was not injured, and the car was later returned to competition after repairing a bent steering wheel. The steering system used on the Bugs was very responsive, about 2 turns lap to lap. However, the cars were very hard to steer, and it took a strong driver just to handle the steering wheel. The drag link between the steering box and the wheels was made of wood. If the wooden drag link had ever snapped in a race, all steering control would have immediately been lost. The Bugs used Firestone demountable rims. It is interesting to note that even though the cars appear to have been built with steel wheels, they were actually wooden spoke artillery wheels covered with a sheet metal disc. The single-seat design used in the construction of the Bugs made them among the first race cars built in this country with no provision for a riding mechanic. The bugs were extremely difficult machines to drive. They kept the driver busy just trying to keep the car running on the track, and as a result, they had virtually no success in closed-circuit track and road racing. However, Berman took his machine to Jacksonville Beach, Florida, where it set several records in straightaway competition. By early 1909, Waldemar's new Marquette Buick hot rods were ready for the team, and the year brought spectacular victories. On February 21st, Berman entered his 1908 Savannah Grand Prize Buick in the Mardi Gras 100-mile speed contest in New Orleans and won in 102 minutes 39 seconds, finishing some 9 miles ahead of the second-place car. Berman also set a new world's record in the process. Strang and DeWitt won their respective classes in a 100-mile event at Daytona on March 23rd. The team left for Atlanta before the Daytona meet was over, and on March 27th, the team was there and ready for the Atlantic Hill Climb. Things went well. The team took a first and a second in Class 1, a first with a new record in Class 4, and won Classes 5 and 6. Buick continued to hammer the competition through the rest of March, April, and May. On April 22nd, Strang, DeWitt, and Louis Chevrolet were at Lookout Mountain, Tennessee for a series of hill climbing events. Strang won 3 events, DeWitt won 1, and Chevrolet ran a special exhibition trial against time. On April 27th, Berman picked up 2 trophies in the Jamaica Speed Trials with a 30-horsepower 4-cylinder, in all probability a Marquette Buick. On June 18th, the team was in Crown Point to compete in the 232-mile Indiana Trophy race. Berman, Chevrolet, and Strang all had cars entered, and Buick was heavily favored. Bad luck. Strang stripped a gear in his rear axle and went out on the second lap. Chevrolet developed engine trouble and dropped out on the fourth. Berman was leading the race until he broke a valve on the 4th lap. He limped around the track, spotted Strang's car off to the side of the course, and cannibalized a replacement part. He was caught and was immediately disqualified. That darn rule book again. The next day, the race was held that Buick really wanted to win at Crown Point, the highly prestigious Coke Trophy. The Coke was a 395.6-mile run over a quadrangular course with a 525 cubic inch engine limit. 12 cars were entered. Berman and Chevrolet were there to represent Buick with their Marquette Buicks. They were officially entered in the code as Buick 30s, and Buick got away with it. The race began at 8 a.m. with the cars starting on the course at 1-minute intervals. Using his normal racing style, Berman ran into the lead on the first lap. On lap 3, he lost control and went off the course. By lap 5, he was done for the day. Chevrolet in the other Model 30 passed a Knox that had gone into the lead after Berman dropped out. Unfortunately, Chevrolet's engine broke a valve and he was forced into the pits. His mechanics were able to get him back into the race, but only on 3 cylinders. Chevrolet was now running 3rd behind the Knox and was more than 20 minutes behind Robertson's first-place Locomobile. Good luck for Buick. Robertson suddenly developed ignition problems and had to pit. By the time a bad magneto had been found and repaired, the Locomobile had lost 33 minutes. Chevrolet managed to pass just as Robertson was re-entering the track. Peter Elvis captured that minute here, that moment here, is painful. Somehow, and Chevrolet was never completely certain exactly how he was able to do it, he moved past the Knox in the standings and won the race by 65 seconds. The win wasn't pretty, and it was completely unexpected in the racing community. However, history would judge the victory to be the most prestigious and the most significant accomplishment enjoyed by the Buick team. In an interesting historical footnote, Buick is said to have taken advantage of a telegraph station set up at the track to get a live commentary of the race wired to an operator in the engineering department at Flint. As the race unfolded and it appeared that Chevrolet had a chance of winning, in spite